Another interesting thing is if you stress a child out too much and it starts having trouble sleeping, one of the things that we do in sleep is we take short-term memories and convert them into longer-term memories. So that can, if you interfere with sleep, you can end up causing some problems with memory in kids, and they don't learn as much, because they'll put it into short-term memory, but it'll never get into long-term memory. So they learn 2 + 2 is 4, but then they forget it right away. So it's real important that we not overstimulate just as much as we don't understimulate a child. Now, how do we learn? I mean, what is important as far as remembering something? There's a lot of things that are involved, but I think 2 things I wanted to bring up tonight. One is repetition, and we all sort of know that. It seems kind of obvious, right? The more times you repeat something, you read something over and over again, or the more times you do something, it's much easier to do it again or remember it again, isn't it? So we all learn math facts, and so now we always remember, that 2 + 2 is 4, and the different types of math problems that there are. We've done those so many times they're almost automatic. Counting money is another thing. We've done those so many times, but for a child who's never done it before, they're learning, and the only way to learn it is to repeat it, is to do it over and over again. Okay. The analogy I use is it's sort of like, have you ever gone hiking through the woods? Kind of a thick woods, okay? I don't know if you've ever done that, if you folks have ever done that, but if you do that once, you walk through a real thick woods and then you turn around and look kind of to see where you have been, it's a little hard to tell where you've been. You can probably figure it out. You can probably go back and track where you've been, but it isn't very easy, is it? On the other hand, if you go through that, on that same path 150 times, it's going to be pretty easy to see where you've been, right? It's the same thing in the brain, okay? You're kind of beating down a path in the brain, okay? You're getting yourself, it's going to be very easy to find the way back if you repeat something over and over again than it is if you do it one time. The other thing about learning and memory is emotions. So the more emotionally charged the subject is, it's much easier to remember it. We all remember, when we got married, let's say, or when we had a first child, or any kind of traumas too. It can be negative emotions as well. Losing a child, or losing a spouse, or divorce, or job loss, or something stressful like that. Those things tend to stick with us more than just things that are not associated with as much emotion. And of course, these things go hand in hand. So the key is, if you have a child and you're trying to teach a child something, if you can get that child interested in it, kind of emotionally, involved in it and interested in it, and then repeat it as well, then they're much more likely to remember that than they are if it's just some boring thing that they have to remember. They basically did a study where they looked at kids who, older kids, and to see if and they gave them emotionally meaningful tasks, something that they were kind of interested in to learn. And they scanned the brain to see the activity in the brain, and they showed that the parts of the brain that were responsible for learning were lighting up like crazy. So they were using their parts of the brain for learning. But when they gave them boring tasks, or they overloaded them with too much information, they basically showed that the learning centers weren't very active at all. So, as you can see, that's sort of, again, we talk a lot in here about brain scans and things like that, but that's another example of how overstimulations can be too much, but by the same token, emotionally meaningful stuff that's not overdoing it is good. So the challenge really, you want to match for that individual child. You want to match what's meaningful to them with some degree of repetition, and and I think the other thing is with what their skills are too. So you'll notice that some kids are a little better mechanically, some are a little better verbally, mathematically. So the different skills. If you can teach to that, that's a great thing. Not that you want to ignore the stuff they're not as good at, but they're going to be pretty, they're going to be much more interested in stuff that they're good at as well. The other thing, and I say this a lot because as parents and teachers, I think it's very important for, well, any of us that have any dealings with kids. We're going to talk about, this is kind of the neuroplasticity thing. We talked about the brain being plastic and, the connections and things that are formed, and how the brain changes. And incidentally, it changes as adults too. Every day of your life, your brain is changing to to some degree. I mean, if you take something home from this talk tonight, you basically have rewired your brain to some small degree. There's new connections that weren't there before, if you remember it. Of course, if you don't remember it past tomorrow, then those connections are gone. Okay, so the repetition that's the key to the repetition. I don't think that we necessarily realize that as adults. I mean, you could be 80 years old and still, as long as you don't have dementia or something else that's interfering with your ability to learn, you can learn new things and basically are changing your brain. And you've heard the old expression, use it or lose it. Well, there's some truth to that. So I'll give you an example for me. I'm a psychiatrist. I don't use much calculus. But in college, I had to take calculus. So I had to know it at one point. But I could look at a calculus problem now and probably not have any idea what I was doing. Those nerve cells and those connections that once did calculus and knew how to do it, they've been recruited to do something else. So they've erased the chalkboard and they've started over doing something else. They do psychiatry now instead of calculus. So our brains, they have a certain degree of limit to what you can do. And so the stuff you do every day and you're very good at, those are the things those are the circuits and the connections that are very strong. And other things tend to fade back to some degree. So I think it's kind of interesting to realize now, if the brain can change like that, in an academic way, if you will, or an intelligence way, what about emotionally? Is it possible that a child that's exposed to some kind of trauma, early on, whether it's sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, things like that, could that somehow affect that child then on into adulthood because it shapes the brain, it sculpts the brain in a way that maybe isn't so healthy? That was an interesting theory, and they did this study where they looked at middle-aged women who had, and they split them into two groups. One group had sexual abuse as kids, and the other group did not. And they looked to see how did their stress response system in the brain, which of course you guys know about. Stress response system, all of us have, animals, everything have. It's responsible for that fight or flight reflex. Something stresses you out and your heart rate goes up and all that stuff. What's happening is cortisol goes up, and cortisol is a hormone in your body, and that is supposed to go up, cause your fight or flight reflex to go up, and then as the stressor eases, it comes back, should come back down hopefully, and you get through the stressor and then you're okay. However, if you have chronic or long-term stress, that cortisol goes up and stays up and can actually damage parts of the brain. The parts of the brain, one of the studies showed that the parts of the brain that control short-term memory, called the hippocampus, those are shrunken in folks that have chronic stress and end up with depression. So they're literally, the theory is the cortisol stays up too long and it can damage some of the nerve cells and some of the circuits in the brain. So these women, what it showed was their stress response system was all out of whack when they had childhood histories of chronic, sexual abuse. What they also found with that is that a lot of them had more trouble with anxiety and depressive disorders, depression and things, than the women who didn't have the childhood histories of trauma. So what you see there is that it could be that the environment shapes that stress response system, which then is permanently changed on into adulthood, and it affects the way they deal with stress. One of the interesting things that we know about is that when the depression is set in place into adulthood, you might think, we talked about some of the brain cells might be damaged. One of the things that antidepressants do, interestingly enough, is they cause new nerve cell formation in the brain. So they actually do that. And also ECT, the electroconvulsive therapy that we've talked about in here before, and I think there's a lot of stigma about that. It actually does that even to a greater degree. I think folks think that, shock therapy, it's burning every brain cell I have and all this kind of thing. And actually that's not the case. It causes more nerve cell formation in the brain. And so that, theoretically, maybe that's how the depression is being treated, because with the depression, you've lost some nerve cells, or they've shrunken or something, and the ECT may end up helping that, and the medications as well. Incidentally, psychotherapy might also help with that. Okay, shifting gears for a second, temperament and personality. I want to talk about, we've talked in here before about personality disorders, but I don't remember if I talked much about where the personality even comes from. Where does a person, we all have one, where does it come from? And the theory is that, we're all born with a thing called a temperament. And most of us have a temperament that runs along some spectrum between really bold and uninhibited